So I just opened up my inbox, and someone had responded to a message I left on a video. I was talking about how the Chinese Communist Party censors information, which they do. Anyway, someone obviously took offence to this, and he came out with a lovely little rant about you white scumbag, and then it was a whole sort of inaudible rant about Western colonialism in China and the usual sort of thing. I've come across this many times before by losers trolling around online, hiding behind their victimhood mentality, and it's utterly pathetic. But at first I was pissed off, but now I honestly feel sorry for people like this, because it must be unpleasant hating an entire ethnic group. When I try to digest that sort of mentality, I think the only answer can be that he or she has been subjected to years and years of a one-party system that promotes its own propaganda. And I know this exists because I've seen it firsthand. I've seen a children's textbook in China that talks about how all the Chinese people love Mao. Now, I don't know why so many Chinese want to obsess over the Opium Wars. I fully understand that historically speaking it was a moment of national humiliation, but I find it hard to understand why there is more outrage about that than there is about the millions killed by Mao. I think part of this lies in the fact that China has always historically been an inward-looking country. It's only in the last 30 years under Deng Xiaoping that it's really opened up. And when you consider its 4,000 plus year old civilization, 30 years really probably isn't enough to change this mentality. There is a very, very deep jingoism at the heart of Chinese society. It's deeply entrenched, and I don't think maybe it's never going to go. I wouldn't go as far as to say racist, because I don't think it's necessarily the same as racist, but there is undeniably an arrogant sort of self-righteousness there that we can condemn foreigners but we'll ignore our own problems, and it's something that I have noticed is very deeply entrenched in the Chinese psyche. Now, before I misunderstood, I want to make clear, when I say deeply entrenched in the Chinese psyche, I'm not talking about everyone. In no way am I saying that every Chinese person endorses this sort of attitude. You know, I've been in communication with Chinese people for quite a long time now, so I think I know them pretty well. And one thing I would say is you cannot generalize a country of 1.4 billion people. You just can't. What I'm referring to is extremists who hide behind their computer screen, and I doubt they would say this to my face, by the way, but they're just very sad people, that they are still enraged about an event that happened over 150 years ago, and they use that to justify their racism today. And let's not beat around the bush. Calling me a white scumbag is racist. It is. You can't gloss over any other way. And it's not so much that I'm that offended by it, it's more that I think it's unfortunate that this sort of situation exists, that there are a lot of very vocal Chinese netizens out there who, I mean, it's interesting because the only way he could be using YouTube is by getting a VPN or by commenting from a Western country. So for all his hatred of Western countries, he is obviously either living in one, or he's refusing to see the irony of the fact that he needs to get a VPN to use a banned website that his beloved Communist Party won't let people get access to. Now, it's different if it's like someone's making an objective argument and they're saying, look, I think the CCP has done some good things, maybe you need to see it from this direction. But when someone opens up an argument with you white scumbag, I automatically switch off, and I automatically think, I'm not wasting time with this loser. I mean, he or she is in absolutely no way to wallow in victimhood about something that happened 150 years ago. So, I think there is a deep nationalist mindset that is widespread in China. You can see it in other countries as well, of course, but the reason China gets some focus is because it is a rising superpower. And it's an interesting thing because when it suits them, these nationalists wallow in victimhood and they talk about what Europeans done, they talk about terrible Japanese wartime atrocities, and that's fine when it suits them. But then when they want to be on top, it's like, oh, you powerful China, you cannot fuck with 1.4 billion people. Look at our army, we will destroy you, and all the usual crap. So they're profoundly... they pick and choose when they want to be... they're extreme in both ways. Either an extreme victimhood mentality matched with an extreme nationalism, and it's actually quite a toxic combination because it's a constant siege mentality. It's not an open mentality at all. And I just think that's a bit sad. One of the most important things any communist leader ever done was Deng Xiaoping's decision to open China up. But unfortunately it's going to take time before that really changes the psyche that it is deeply embedded in Chinese society, which is inward looking. Xi Jinping, I think, is starting to do that, but at the same time he's also promoting this neo-nationalism, which I think is unfortunate. It's not a case of leaders defending their country. Every world leader does that, but in China I do believe there's massive dishonesty out there. I just cannot stand the hypocrisy of talking about all the bad things Europeans done and how evil the Japanese were, and yet completely whitewashing what the Chinese Communist Party has done over the last half century. It is a simple fact that their policies have killed more Chinese than probably all the Europeans and the Japanese combined. And that is not trivializing, for example, what the Japanese done. It's not. I'm fully aware of the rape of Nanking and all the other atrocities. They were terrible events, there's no doubt about that. But for young Chinese to use that as an excuse today, I think is a bit... I don't like that, because then it comes into not just hating the Japanese government, but hating all Japanese people. And I almost lost a friendship recently because of this, because I tried to point out to my friend, look, you can't hate all Japanese because of what happened in the war. So this is a very deeply built mentality, and it's quite sad, really. But unfortunately this very ugly Chinese nationalism sometimes rears its head in the West, and I get quite pissed off when that happens, because it's just an incredibly arrogant way to behave. It's no better than British football hooligans going to other countries and bringing our flag into disrepute. I do get frustrated when I see neo-nationalist Chinese students, and I want to be careful here because I'm really not talking about everyone, but there is a hardcore minority who behave like that, and it's just incredibly arrogant behaviour, because they're taking advantage of the freedom of expression that is in this society. We can't really do anything about it because they'll just say, oh, well, the West, freedom of speech, we can say this. And yet there's a real irony in that, because if I wanted to make a similar protest in China, for example, about Xinhua stirring up hostility towards Westerners, I couldn't do that. So it just pisses me off, the sort of hypocrisy that does exist, and how they're so... I cannot stand anyone who hides behind a victimhood mentality, who uses someone else's suffering to justify their own racism, i.e. because their great-great-great-grandparents may have suffered as a result of the Opium Wars, and they feel that they have a right to treat all white people like shit. It's stupid. And like I say, it's more a case that I feel sorry for them than it does make me, I'll be honest, it does frustrate me, and it does bug me sometimes, but I'm trying to take the logic of, rather than lowering myself to their level and just, throwing mud back at them, I just either ignore them or I tell them that and say, I feel sorry for you. It must be a really unpleasant feeling hating half of the world, or a significant portion of it. So if you're Chinese, I'm not saying you can't defend your country, I'm just saying do it in a reasonable way. Don't be such extremists. It's a completely natural thing. Most people on some level will defend their country. I do it myself. When people criticise Britain, sometimes I defend Britain, but I do try to be objective, and I will try and look at the criticism and think, okay, that's a fair point. With some neo-nationalists, I mean, I'm talking about the Chinese, but I mean any neo-nationalists, they're just so blinded by their lemon-us mentality that they cannot see reason. And you cannot try to negotiate with these people. You cannot try to have a civil debate with them. I mean, I could have reached out to this guy and said, oh yes, and grovel to him and say, yes, we were evil, we shouldn't have done that, etc. But I'm thinking, I don't need to do that. Not when he's talking to me like that. Because the initial point I made, I believe, was done in a reasonable manner. It's not that I came out with an extreme statement. I just said a fact. The CCPC does censor information. And that is an indisputable fact. He would probably even acknowledge it. So yeah, I get a little bit nauseated, and I do think it's incredibly hypocritical. If you're Chinese and you're using YouTube and then you're attacking how awful the West is, why don't you stop and think for a second, well wait a second, why is YouTube banned in China? Why not criticise that? So I just get sick of this hypocrisy, and I think that some of them use nationalism to hide behind it. It's pathetic. I would be saying the same, by the way, to Britons who had the same mentality, like, we never done anything wrong, and etc. I would challenge them. I mean, I have already confronted extreme Britons, like Britain First, for example. I just feel very sad that there are people out there that have such a nauseating lemon-us mentality. Because in the end of the day, the people that hurt the most are themselves. Because they alienate themselves. And just to clarify, this is not about all Chinese people, not at all. I would never in a million years say the Chinese are like this. What I'm referring to here is extreme Chinese nationalists whose behaviour I just think is pathetic. And I do think it's stirred up by the Communist Party, which is shameful. Because the same sort of things would not be tolerated in the West. And I do still believe that the West is far more tolerant than most East Asian countries are. I'm not talking about friendliness. If you go to China, you'll find that young people are for the most part very hospitable, very welcoming. But if China was ever as diverse as Britain was, I think the racism would be far more intense. There's absolutely no way that China would be as accepting of the sort of multicultural society that Britain has. No way. And there is a casual racism in China that is very often excused. Even moderate Chinese will say, oh, it's not really racism, they're just ignorant people, or they're being rude. So they'll trivialize it. But I think we need to see racism for what it is, racism. Because any intelligent, educated person, and that's what bothers me about these people, the sort of people who are leaving these comments are not poor, uneducated peasants. They tend to be university educated people. So in my opinion, they've got no excuses for their bullshit. So, to conclude, I feel sorry for them. I just feel sorry for them. Because it's not a case of denying what things China has suffered in the past. It's a case of seeing that there's an obvious hypocrisy there. And it does piss me off. Because it's like, oh, it doesn't matter that Mao killed millions, but we're going to attack the British who humiliated the Qing dynasty over 150 years ago. I think that's incredibly hypocritical.